I'm the guy who booked the rooms. I don't get any credit other than that. So the rules of the event are no shouting. Or actually you'll be removed. No non-inclusive language, racial slurs, gender slurs. That would also result in removal, so we're very strict about being civil here tonight. In the event of a fire alarm, now I know that's never going to happen. But in the event of a fire alarm, we'll all go out, we'll be escorted back out, and then once the fire department has cleared it, we can come back and resume. So that's good news. The media, just all of you.
Am I allowed to shout?
Just watch it, okay? So, I was going to say a joke last time, and I'll get to that in a moment. But first I want to say, when I first heard about Francis's topic about indigenization and would that have any impact on free inquiry, I just thought, what a crazy proposition, and how would you ever prove this? Like how could indigenization have any impact, one way or the other, on free inquiry? And then this week has just proved why. This topic is apparently a sacred object in the sense of Jonathan Haidt, and it can't be discussed. And we had a new policy implemented last week of abnormal security costs are now assessed to the sponsoring group. Of course, we know which sorts of groups are going to end up paying these security costs. And just yesterday, the president sent out an email, thinly veiled but scathing, about this topic, and then the union sent out an even more insulting email. So actually, it's really, really hard to have this discussion, apparently, as you can see from the barricades out front. That said, I want to get to the joke, which I tried to say at the Faith Gold event, which is, in the words of the famous philosopher George Costanza, we're living in a civilization here, Lindsay.
First, acknowledge the donors that made this event possible. We raised $5,473 in security fees, and we raised that amount in 8 hours, and actually ended up with more later through our GoFundMe campaign. So yes, this event, and it's going to be a low-key, chill event, I think, and it cost us $5,500. Anyway, so thank you to them. And yeah, just to expand on what Will was saying, so there was a lot leading up to this event, a lot of interesting things. So yes, the Wilfrid Laurier University Faculty Association Diversity and Equity Committee set up a crowdfunding campaign called the Indigenous Knowledge Fund. I think these faculty associations are actually starting to like LSOI because we give them the opportunity to get money from people to prove their allegiance to diversity. So you may recall that the University of Waterloo Faculty Association held a multicultural UW fundraiser in response to our canceled April event with Faith Goldie and Ricardo Chen. So it really gives them an opportunity. Okay, and then Wilfrid Laurier University Faculty Association releases a statement saying, the Wilfrid Laurier University Faculty Association Executive recognizes that recent actions by the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry are not, in fact, promoting intellectual debate on our university campuses, but seem instead to be manufacturing a free speech crisis at Laurier where none exists. So that to me is some pretty patently we're actually proving that there is a crisis. And tonight's event really is promoting intellectual debate. And it's disturbing that these university faculty members are so dishonest about that. And yes, President Deborah Nicolaci sent an email out to faculty and staff saying Laurier is completely dedicated to freedom of expression, but there's a crowdfunding campaign called the Indigenous Knowledge Fund you could donate to, and on May 9th from 6:30 to 8:30, so right now, Laurier's Office of Indigenous Initiatives is holding a Gathering of Good Minds pipe ceremony. And of course we have the lovely anti-fascist protesters doing whatever it is they do at Okay, so Dr. Widdowson, in my eyes, is so great because she questions things and says things that no one else dares to question and say. But I will pass it over to ELSA Executive Anton, who will introduce her.
Hi folks, so here we have Dr. Frances Widdowson. She's an Associate Professor in the Department of Economics, Justice and Policy Studies at Mount Royal University in Calgary, Alberta. Dr. Widdowson is the co-author with Albert Howard of Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, The Deception Behind Indigenous Cultural Preservation, and has studied indigenization for over 20 years. She has a peer-reviewed book coming out in a year called Separate but Unequal, called Parallelist Ideology Conceals the History and Material Roots of Indigenous Dependency. And this is going to be published by the University of Ottawa. It's a peer-reviewed book, unlike some critics here, claiming that she has none. So that's coming out next year. So Dr. Widdowson, very accomplished, very acclaimed, and we're lucky enough to have her here today speaking to us. So give a warm round of applause to her, folks.
Can people hear me from here? Because I will just speak like this. I'll just be constrained at the mic if I don't speak like this. But I'm pretty used to talking with my speaker's voice, so I'm just going to do that. I really appreciate the efforts of the Laurier Society for Open Inquiry. It's a great organization. I also wanted to mention the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship, which I'm a member. I'm a coordinator of the membership outreach for that organization. If it costs $25 a year, and you get 3 great newsletters with very interesting articles. These are the kinds of organizations that we really need today. This is absolutely terrible. I can't even. I'm just shocked. That's all I can say. I'm absolutely shocked. I would expect a university to come out in favor of these contentious discussions. This is why we're here. And yet, they want to almost prevent people from hearing things, or I guess they do. I can't understand it. And the Faculty Association, hang your head in shame. That is disgusting. I belong to a faculty association at Mount Royal, a great faculty association. Now we have some members who are a bit problematic, but the faculty association says, hey, we're for fairness. We want to defend academic principles. We're not here to defend, whatever crazy things that you might get up to, but we want to make sure that you have a fair hearing and that you are treated to a fair process. That is not what this faculty association is doing, and I'm just absolutely appalled by what they've done. And I'm not going to say anything more about that. We should all be reading George Orwell. George Orwell knew what was happening in all forms of totalitarianism. And for people who don't know this, George Orwell was a socialist, right? And I'm a socialist as well, which is totally ironic. I went out and tried to talk to the protesters and said, hey, I agree with your signs here. We're in agreement. It's just that we don't seem to be understanding each other very well. So why don't you come in, hear the talk, and maybe we can reach a better understanding of what's going on and why I think that indigenization is a serious problem for universities in general, but it is a serious problem especially for Indigenous students. They are the ones who are going to be harmed by indigenization. So it's not anti-Indigenous, it's pro-Indigenous. The actual anti-Indigenous people are all the lawyers and consultants who are all making the money off of initiatives like indigenization, which are just terribly thought out, anti-intellectual, destructive to education generally, but especially destructive to education for Indigenous students. So, I'll just give you a bit of a sense. I don't want to spend too much time on things because it would be great to have question and answer, and let's go for beers afterwards as well. We could all use a double scotch, I'm sure. At least I'm sure I could, after going through all the things that have been gone through over the last 2 months. Okay, so I just want to cover a few things, like open inquiry in universities. Just generally want to talk about that. What is university indigenization? I have been studying university indigenization, or actually indigenization, for over 20 years. And I actively go out and find people that I don't agree with. That's critical thinking. Not getting into your echo chamber and having a whole bunch of groupthink exercises, which Laurier seems to be really intent on doing. Hence the pipe ceremony. Why schedule that at the same time? That means the people who go to the pipe ceremony aren't going to be able to come to this talk. Was that intentional? Let's keep ourselves in our own separate boxes so that we can't discuss things and get to the truth of the matter. Then why is university indigenization promoted? And I've studied this a lot, so I understand why this is complete false information as to what indigenization is going to do, and I'm going to explain why. And there's 3 basic reasons that I'm going to get into, which concern symbolic recognition, reconciliation, that sort of stuff, improving Indigenous education itself, and then increasing knowledge of, in the university as a whole. Those 3 things will not happen with indigenization. So what they're promising actually will have the opposite effect, and I'll talk about that very briefly. And then, why is this happening? And we talked about this in the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship a while back about all these really strange initiatives. What's driving them? Money. Money's driving them. There's a lot of money to be made with indigenization. I just saw University of Calgary put out a tweet a couple of hours ago. You can get all sorts of grants if you're going to go into indigenization. So indigenization pays. It's going to benefit the indigenizers. The people who will suffer are Indigenous people. That's who it's going to hurt. And everyone should know that. That is the big problem. We're trying to solve problems with respect to Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. Indigenous people, they're the ones who are going to be hurt by it. Right? And that's what we have to keep in mind, is that you always have to be thinking about, we want to improve circumstances for Indigenous people. How will indigenization do that? It won't do it. It'll make some money for some privileged people in universities, and I'm sure the lawyers are going to get their cut somewhere along the line, which is the whole nature of Indigenous politics these days. So that's the situation. I'll try and move through this relatively quickly. Lindsay's going to ask me a few questions. We discussed this ahead of time to say what would be some more questions for her to raise, and I'll try to answer them as fully as I can, and then we can open it up for discussion and then go drink and have some more discussions. Okay, so top of I should have forgot to mention that thing at the top. That is my colleague at Mount Royal who calls me a pathetic racist, right? And I sent him an email saying, either you're believe this and you're misinformed, or you're unethical and you're trying to smear my reputation. He responded back and said I was a bully and I was trying to bully him, and that I was going to sick all my, Jordan Peterson's Twitter followers on him and so on. And I said, are you kidding me? I'm just telling you, I'm going to talk about you here. I didn't mention his name because I don't want him to be doxxed and have all sorts of people going after him, but that's a real situation that I'm facing at Mount Royal, which again is, open inquiry isn't possible. Okay, so open inquiry. The university is about pursuing the truth. That was my understanding of a university. And what happens though, and this is Jonathan Haidt, he's an interesting American academic, and he talks about this. It's on the internet. You can just, the 2 telosis of the university. When you start insisting that the university's got to pursue quote-unquote social justice, what happens is that if the conception of social justice interferes with the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of truth is going to get clobbered. And that's what's happening with indigenization, is that the truth about indigenization is inconsistent with these people who call themselves social justice people And so we can't talk about indigenization. It's important to keep in mind, and I see this on the social media all the time, that those left-wing people, those far leftists, it's not left-wing people we're talking about here. They're not the ones who are the problem. I'm a left-wing person. The problem is what's called politically correct totalitarianism. And that is, I know I'm right, the issues have been settled, we don't have to talk about this anymore. And that notion actually came about in the Catholic Church a couple hundred years ago with the phrase, error has no rights. That's what the Catholics said. So we don't need to let all these other religions, have their say, because they're obviously the wrong religions, because the Catholic religion is the right religion. Therefore, no one who's not a Catholic can't say anything. This is the same thing that we're seeing with respect to the politically correct dimension on university campuses. And if you just follow social media, you can see this, which is, we know indigenization is right. We're going to impose it. Anyone who disagrees with it is going to be silenced. That's the situation. When actually indigenization is a terrible initiative and should be opposed because of the harm that it's going to cause to people in universities. Indigenization, what is it? A lot of people are probably wondering about this because usually it's very fuzzy and no one can really sort of figure out what it is. What is this indigenization? And I hear people saying a lot about indigenization, which really has nothing to do with what the main elements of indigenization are. And basically it comes out of diversity policy, which is created by what's called the ideology of the politics of identity and entitlement, IPOL, which means not only the politics of identity and entitlement, it also means ideological policing. So people are going to really watch what you say, and if you say the wrong thing, they're going to call you a racist and a colonialist and a white supremacist. That's the nature of it. And it has three dimensions of it, which are, it wants to increase the amount of indigenous content and people. That's how it started out. And that's actually been happening since the 70s. And really, it doesn't have very much to do with the current indigenization initiative. But it's still, that's the one that you obviously promoted. The second aspect is symbolic recognition. So the idea that we should change the names of buildings, we should have prayers at the beginning of meetings, we should have territorial acknowledgements. That's a major part of current indigenization efforts. And then the most serious one that I've been talking about a lot for the last 3 years, which is that indigenous, what's called ways of knowing, which is never defined, never really understood, should be respected and valued. And at Mount Royal, we actually have a strategic plan which says that we must value indigenous ways of knowing. So it's a dictate that we should value this. And then when you ask people, well, what are these indigenous ways of knowing? What is this? They say, well, you should come to these sessions that we're going to have about this over the next year. Well, how do we know we should value it? Why are you saying value it if you don't even know what it is? That gives you a bit of a sense of the what's at work here, which is not really being very specific and then going to impose something which is very problematic. So, this is what university indigenization is. It sounds really good on the surface, but it has a number of harmful effects, which I'm going to talk about. And I should mention the graphic at the top. That's David Doherty, the president of Mount Royal University. And Doherty has got one more year at Mount Royal because his term wasn't renewed. There's a lot of anger about him. And he had this ceremony that was held in his honor. And he was given a name, an indigenous name at that ceremony. The indigenous name meant, in the indigenous language, wise leader. And there's a lot of people at Mount Royal that would take a bit of some issue with that. And that's an example of indigenization. Great public relations for David Doherty, not very good for indigenous people. That's the general situation that we're talking about. Okay, so indigenization, those three elements of indigenization that I was talking about, which is increasing the content and number of Indigenous faculty and students, increasing Indigenous ways of knowing, valuing, symbolic recognition. It's argued that, for example, symbolic recognition will allow Indigenous, non-Indigenous reconciliation. That's one of the things which is put forward. It'll allow us to respect one another, for Indigenous people to know that they're valued within the university. It's argued that various elements will improve Indigenous educational levels. So we hear about the terrible gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. Indigenization is argued will improve this situation. And thirdly, it's maintained that Indigenous ways of knowing, bringing in these new perspectives, will actually increase general knowledge and understanding within the university. Indigenization will not do any of these things. It will actually be contrary to these three goals. I think that generally it will cause resentment. It's not going to enable reconciliation to occur, because generally what's happening with all this symbolism is just paying lip service to Indigenous people. It's not honestly engaging with Indigenous people. And if you talk to people on campus and say, well, what do you think about the land acknowledgement? People just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, this sounds like a good, like, why not? It's a good thing to do. It's just to show that we really care, or this sort of thing. And so I was thinking about this. Well, that's a very interesting way to look at that. I wonder what Indigenous people think about this. So when people are saying at the beginning of meetings, just sort of throwing this off at the beginning of a meeting, and now it's being imposed at Mount Royal, it's actually going to be part of our General Faculty's Council. It's just been decided by David Doherty, who said, it's just the right thing to do. That's what he said. And we weren't going to discuss it. Because if we discussed it, then there could maybe be some oppositional views that were expressed, and we certainly don't want to have that happen at a university. That would just not be good. So when I looked into this further, and this is the CAUT, Canadian Association of University Teachers webpage, they gave a link to another article. It's in Megaphone, and you can just look this up on the internet, and they had some Indigenous people talking about this. And basically, some Indigenous people think that you are acknowledging that the land belongs to Indigenous people when you do those territorial acknowledgements, right? And that'll be news to a lot of people who have deeds to their homes and so on, and also the university, right? And I've always been opposed to this, because I say to people, university land doesn't belong to Indigenous people. It belongs to all of us. It's a public space where we can all come in and discuss things on equal terms without reference to our ancestry. And the article also said that when you do this, it's got to be heartfelt. You really got to mean it. It can't just be you begin at the beginning of a meeting, and then you just get on with the actual business. That's not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be incorporating that ethos into everything that you do at the meeting. And that's not what people are doing. So if you're an Indigenous person thinking that's what's happening, you're going to be very resentful about the fact that here are these people, again, trying to pacify you with these symbolic gestures which mean nothing. They're completely meaningless for most people who utter them. And that is just completely condescending and unacceptable at a university for this to be imposed. And I also encountered a problem with this at the University of Calgary when Albert Howard and I were giving discussions on indigenization. When we started saying some things that were felt to be offensive at this panel, Indigenous people said to us, "You be quiet. You are guests on the land of Indigenous people. How dare you say these critical things at this indigenization forum?" So people want to know how this impacts open inquiry. Well, people thinking that you're a guest on the land of Indigenous people and should only say things which the hosts agree with is going to have serious problems for open inquiry. So that's the first problem with the symbolic recognition. Resentment, not reconciliation. Second, about the increasing educational achievement, improving in educational achievement in Aboriginal people. This here is the gap that's always talked about, and this doesn't include on reserve Indigenous people, by the way. So it's really, really terrible education on reserves. So one of the main things about indigenization is you try to increase the number of Indigenous faculty. But because Indigenous educational levels are low, if you want to increase the number of Indigenous faculty, they're going to have lower qualifications than non-Indigenous faculty. So you're going to have lower quality Indigenous educators and the students as well, right? People who are testing out at grade 8 or whatever's happening in the reserves, they're going to be coming into universities because of the targeted seats that are being made available for Indigenous students. This is going to set up a system of failure for Indigenous students that we should be very, very concerned about in universities. And it's not going to really matter anyway. The way we're going to deal with that is we're going to divert Indigenous students into indigenized courses, where instead of having written examinations, you're going to have oral examinations. All these kinds of things. For example, at my university, we talked about, you should get credit for bringing food to a feast. That should give you credit in a university course, right? So if you do this for Indigenous students, then you're going to get a BA or whatever degree you get, but you're not going to have gone through all the rigorous kinds of processes that are going to happen for other students at a university. So this is setting up, again, a situation where we're doing a disservice to Indigenous students with these kinds of situations. Not addressing this problem, which is what needs to be addressed in the universities or in the primary schools, is really where it's got to be addressed. And then finally, the biggest problem which I face on a day-to-day basis in universities, which is the various disciplines, right, that are being undermined by the indigenization process. The right-hand graphic, I had a panel, this was in 2017, this is on the internet. Massimo Pigliucci, who I have a great deal of respect for. He's a philosopher and a biologist. He's a skeptic. He goes and questions things all the time. And he came and he participated in this panel and wrote it up on his blog. And after discussing the various things that happened, basically his conclusion, which was similar to the conclusions that Albert Howard and I have reached, is that there's just a number of elements of indigenization. The first that was mentioned was, Indigenous elders and people around the land do have knowledge of plants and animals. So you go and ask them about various plants and their healing properties, you talk to them about animals, but this is very proto-scientific. It's not systematic, the methodologies that are used. So if the elders say that there are more polar bears, in order to make that determination, you have to count the polar bears and use some methodology, but elders just have this impression, which might be due to just more polar bears coming into towns because of ice deteriorating, climate change, or whatever's happening. So that's not systematic. At Mount Royal, art historian was going to develop a course, and she was told after doing this, because she was getting into Indigenous spirituality, which is part of art history, the artworks of Indigenous people, you're white. You can't teach this because you don't have that racially essentialist connection to the spirits that Indigenous people do. And that's what we get into that a lot, is that you really can't teach something if you're not Indigenous. That's not the ethos of the university. The university is you get the method, you're able to explore all different cultures. I'm not just limited to studying people from England, where my ancestors came from. I can look at France, I can look at China, I can look at Africa. This is not a thing that we should be promoting in the university. We had an event on Indigenous medicine. An elder was brought up as part of the Indigenization initiative. Someone asked him from the audience, what do you do about gut problems in children, stomach problems that children have? Well, you take some corn pollen, you rub the corn pollen on the bottoms of your child's feet, and you do a sunrise ceremony. That's the way to address gut problems, which could be anything from stomach cancer to appendicitis. This is a serious problem. There was people in that room, scientists, who thought it was appalling. They never said a word because they knew if they did, there would be trouble for them. And they just kept their head down and were appalled. But this was a serious situation. Some child is not getting properly diagnosed. And then we have the problems of history and archaeology. Chris DiCarlo, which Lindsay was on a panel with, I guess, a couple weeks ago, he wrote a sentence on his board, "We're all Africans." Indigenous people didn't like that. Because they said, hey, our elders don't say that. They say that we came out of the Americas, we were created here. He's been having a terrible time trying to get a job because of his outspoken stance on evolutionary theory, which is opposed by many people, what would be indigenized archaeology. These are huge problems. They're not really being addressed because the fear that if you start speaking up about this, you'll be labeled a racist or even worse, a white supremacist, which is happening to a number of people, myself included. So, why is this happening? Follow the money. It is about money. That is the main thing why indigenization is happening. What happens with indigenization is two things. You can put up barriers to entry to other people who are competing on jobs and contracts. Lawyers are the main rent seekers in this cartoon, and lawyers I'm sure are involved. But if you can say that you have to be Indigenous to teach a course, then you exclude automatically non-Indigenous professors. And then tying is the other way in which rent seeking happens, which is if you can connect indigenization with worthwhile kind of social types of processes. Say you're going to help with reconciliation, you'll be able to increase the amount of funds that are going to those initiatives. So you have an academic thing that you're pretending to be academic, but it's also going to be associated with improving Indigenous, non-Indigenous relations. It's more likely you're going to be able to get money for that initiative. And that's what's called tying academic programs to other goals which don't have anything to do with indigenization. The effect that this has is the lowering of academic standards, right, both in terms of the faculty in universities, but also in terms of the actual courses and the curriculum, right, because these indigenous ways of knowing, as I mentioned, are not actually ways of knowing. They're generally spiritual beliefs, that's what they are, and they're contrary to the scientific method and actually understanding why things happen in the world. And then the worst problem of this at all, and I really cannot stress this enough, because people keep on saying that I'm anti-Indigenous. I'm not anti-Indigenous. I'm trying to help Indigenous people, the educational problems in the Indigenous communities. Pretending that Indigenous people have ways of knowing which should be promoted actually prevents various academic programs from emerging which can facilitate the actual development of understanding, which is not going to happen because we're just going to be diverting Indigenous people into these various indigenized areas within the university. Thank you very much.
So first, I want to start off with, when I was out there with the protesters, they were handing out pamphlets, and one thing they said was, this event is racist as fuck. So what would you say to those who say you are racist or a white supremacist?
Yes. Well, I did go out and try to discuss things with people who are protesting, and it was interesting because I do agree with the signs of it. Like I do think that the working class is going to be the way in which progress is going to unfold in society. I do think that capitalism is unsustainable. I don't care what people call it. I'm here to pursue the truth, and I'm going to do it regardless of what happens. not take things personally. See yourself as a symbol that people are trying to fight against, and that'll be helpful for it. And it's a long process, it's difficult. I force myself to read all this social media stuff because I want to know what people are saying, but it is like you get a visceral reaction. So that's the first thing. The second thing is there's a huge confusion that's going on here, and I noticed that with one of my colleagues who called me a pathetic racist, which I was trying to explain to him. I said, you're confusing biological characteristics with learned behavior, which are traits that all of us share, all of our ancestors shared. And this is a huge problem in indigenization, which is not recognized, which is that hunting and gathering societies, their cultures, because of productivity and technology, are less developed than modern nation states. And that's not to say all indigenous people, it's just related to them, because there's many indigenous people who are completely integrated. And just because you smudge on Fridays or whatever you do, doesn't mean that you can't completely integrate and be productive in modern society. It's just like going to church or doing other kinds of things like that, right? It doesn't affect the rest of your life. But think about the isolated indigenous communities. 75% of indigenous communities, at least, are completely isolated from modern society. And there you see serious problems in terms of being able to do things like work by the clock, develop abstract forms of reasoning. And people say, you're saying indigenous people can't do that. That's not true at all. Everyone can do that. We're all human beings. But you need to have educational programs in place that enable that transition to occur. And what indigenization is doing is it's trying to keep indigenous people isolated and separate. And that will keep them dependent on what Albert Howard and I have called the aboriginal industry, which is these lawyers and consultants who are keeping indigenous people dependent. So I think it's a confusion, but also an avoidance tactic of trying to deal with the reality.
All right, so at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario, all new BA students are required to take at least 16 credits of Indigenous content courses during their degree program. And at the University of Winnipeg in Manitoba, taking one 3-credit course in Indigenous Studies is also a degree requirement. So what do you think about these indigenization initiatives that involve course requirements and degree requirements?
I think it's a mistake. Not because I don't think there should be Indigenous courses that exist, and this is, again, a big misunderstanding, is that, we should have, many Indigenous courses in all areas. There's two problems with these courses, though. One is it's kind of forcing people to take these courses. So, and this is, again, going to lead to a lot of resentment of people who are having to take these courses. And it again raises the question of, why single out the study of Indigenous people? Like, what about the study of, Chinese laborers who built the railway? Or what about, various other ethnic groups? Or what about women and their position within society? I don't quite understand why Indigenous people are being singled out to have the courses on them. It seems to me to be an ideological position that the main kind of cleavage in Canadian society is between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and reinforcing that through various courses. Even worse is how those courses are going to be taught, which is, are we going to have critical thinking that's going to be employed in those courses? Right? Where you're encouraged to challenge the views that are put forward about Indigenous and non-Indigenous relations. And I see this with my indigenization colleagues. When the Colton Bushy case came and the farmer was acquitted, one of my colleagues wrote on Twitter, next week is going to be, a teach-in, and we're going to talk about how that verdict was unjust. Right? Now, it's possible that verdict was unjust, but it's a very contentious area. So you wouldn't want to be a student in that course and raise an objection to that and say, well, maybe that verdict actually, that seems reasonable to me based upon the evidence. And that's the difficulty, is that often indigenization is not about education, it's about indoctrination. And I worry about these kinds of courses and who's going to teach them and how they're going to be taught. And I think that's going to be a big problem with these courses.
All right, and my last question before we open up to the floor. In summary, what do you see as the major issues with studying Indigenous ways of knowing? Like, why shouldn't we just let this happen?
Yeah, and I have followed a number of comments about this. There's a great blog post on the internet which is by, his name is, his pseudonym is Ernest Everhard. And he goes over this. I believe it's the Iron Heel. Anyway, he's railing against the current postmodern left, and he's an actual, labor leftist who really thinks that the postmodernists are running riot over things. Anyway, he's talking about this. He says, at face value, it seems like it's a good idea. Like, don't we want to bring in other perspectives? See how an Indigenous person would see this? Well, that's a bit of a stereotype, right? Because why should we assume that Indigenous people have one perspective? Right? So that's another problem. But okay, let's bring in a whole bunch of different Indigenous perspectives, and let's just see how this is viewed and analyze it and so on. That sounds great. Okay, but the problem is indigenization is insisting that you must value those perspectives. And this is one of my big objections that I had about indigenization from the very beginning. He said, how can the university tell us to value anything? Aren't we here to find out what we should value? So you look at the perspective, and maybe it has something to offer, maybe it doesn't, but that's going to be determined through examining it critically and seeing whether the reasons that are provided are valid. Is there evidence to support that perspective? And so what you often find, and that was the case with when the Indigenous healer was brought in, is that that person should have been challenged, especially about the pollen, the corn pollen and the sunrise ceremony. I was thinking I should even just do it on the basis of ethics. That here now this woman is going to go and do this treatment for her child, and I should maybe say something. But the whole mood in the room was one of celebration. And I, quite frankly, felt sorry for this elder as well, because he'd kind of been brought in, everyone was telling him how great it was that he had this way of knowing that he was going to share with us, and to start, sort of saying this is quackery, which I think it is, would have been really disrespectful to that person and sort of the auspices under which he was brought to the university. So this is the difficulty. Not that I think that it's possible that some Indigenous perspectives could help us to shed light on things as well. There's nothing wrong with the study of Indigenous perspectives, and this was mentioned to me by the previous Dean of Arts, is that we study Christianity, we study Buddhism, we study Hinduism. Why can't we study Indigenous spirituality? He said, well, we should study Indigenous spirituality. There's nothing wrong with that. What's being argued, though, is not that. It is you must respect Indigenous spirituality as a way of knowing. Right? No one's saying that Christianity is a way of knowing, or Buddhism is, or we're certainly not saying we should Buddhicize the university or Islamicize the university. Well, we shouldn't be doing that. We don't want to be doing that. We want to fight against that, right? But we can still appreciate that, Islamic people have this belief system. There's this book called the Quran. We can study that and look at it, the politics of it, or the sociology of it, and so on. That's fine. But don't say you must accept that as a valid argument. And even worse, if you don't, you're disrespectful to Indigenous people, because it's actually the opposite. By condescending to Indigenous people and pretending that you agree with them when you actually don't, that, in my view, is the worst kind of disrespect that you can show another human being. I know that there's a number of Indigenous people who don't agree with me and, in fact, are upset by what I say. but I'm doing this out of respect. I'm treating them just like I would treat any other human being. If I don't agree with someone, I tell them why I don't agree with them. I should not be pretending that I agree with Indigenous people when I actually don't.
All right, so that means it's time for open floor questions. I saw your hand first.
So, at the beginning of the talk, you talked about ideological evolution. I don't know, like, do you sense any hypocrisy when you say that, like, their medicine might be quackery, or, like, we have our scientific method, and you're not following that, so, like, you need to adopt our scientific method because you're doing not working, and it's even unethical, as you said. Like, isn't that in a sense, like, a form of ideological policing? Because they have their ideology, they're very tied to nature, and that's how they want to live. And we have our Western industrial society, we have, complicated pharmaceuticals, whatever. And in a sense, we're almost imposing that on them, saying, come live like us. We have the right answer. We have the right way of thinking. Do you see any, like, hypocrisy there at all?
Not at all. And the reason for that is because science is not an ideology.
And scientism is.
Science is a method which can help all of us understand the world today, right? And in fact, Indigenous people, in terms of, they have need for antibiotics and all the modern medical, things that everyone else needs. And to not provide that is just a terrible double standard that we have. So I think ideology is a political belief system about what the world should be like. So that's ideological. In political science, we talk about it in terms of you're prescribing what the world should be like. You have a vision for what society should be, and you're prescribing, how to get there, those sorts of things. Scientific methodology is a rigorous method that helps us to understand why things are the way that they are.
But maybe it's just that, like, are you worried that in pursuing that avenue of almost encouraging them to assimilate, it might create resentment on their part and counter reconciliation?
Well, I don't think there should be assimilation. And this is a bit of a problem in discussions, is that assimilation was what happened in the past, and that was a very coercive way of going about it. That you've got to kind of get rid of who you are, and you just have to become, sort of coerced to become part of the society. Indigenous people, if they want to put corn pollen on their children's feet, as a ceremony and so on, no one's preventing that from happening, right? But there should be also scientific medicine, it should be provided to Indigenous communities. So I think this and I'm not saying that you're saying this, but I often do hear people saying things like, science is a colonialist method. That's colonialism. Well, one could argue that, colonization occurred and, scientific processes, allowed technology to be discovered that then resulted in X and Y, but that doesn't mean that science itself is colonialist, right? In fact, science has been a huge benefit to colonized people all over the planet because of the, basically the, traditional medicine, quote-unquote medicine, which is, in my view, quackery.
All right, I saw a hand up there. Yep.
I agree with you in a lot of things.
Sorry, can you speak up a little bit?
Sure. I came here with an open mind to listen to what you have to say, knowing that we would disagree on a lot of points, but I took a lot of notes and I do want to share a few things. When you talk about the pursuit of truth, whose truth? And I'm going to give you just a simple example, right? Take Oxford University, for example, which was founded around 1096, but women were only allowed at Oxford in 1920. And for a very long time, and I have two cousins at Oxford right now, and for a very long time, the knowledge of even female sexuality was not at all considered in any of the studies that involved, the science that involved human bodies. So that's my first question for you. Whose truth, and how do you then make space for other knowledges that can be added to the very scientific method that you and I agree are incredibly important? I do not disagree with the scientific method, but I do know that not everybody's contribution to the scientific method has been able to be made up to this point. The other question I had, when you talk about liberty, based on what ethics? Because I am a primary teacher with the Waterloo Catholic District School Board. The Catholic part, the spirituality part, I agree with you. I teach my students to be critical thinkers, and I teach children. I teach grade 1, 2 students who I hope will also, beyond being academic thinkers, will also be caring members of the society. And when I hear your pursuit of liberty, I want to know, where do you stand on the ethics of justice, ethics of critique, and ethics of care? Because it's the current knowledge around all of us here who actually study ethics, which I majored on and I actually have a master's on, that if you really are a body with strong ethics, you have to be looking through all these 3 spheres. So I have a lot more notes that I took, but I would like to just stay on that note, because I don't disagree with many of the things that you say, but I also think that the level of depth of this conversation is a little offensive to people with ways of knowing and learning that are attached to particular methods that are attached to the land. The land is what the ways of knowing and learning. It's not hokey pokey. It's not hippie. Let's face it. There's crazy people everywhere. I agree with you on that. But people like Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who is a quantum physicist in BC, who follows incredibly very, very methodic methods. He's also Indigenous, and he has a lot to offer to our society as a whole. So, and also on that note, I also want to say, I teach children who are Black, Indigenous, white. I also teach children of many different religions, because the Catholic Board has recently opened the doors to all sorts of religions. And ultimately, I want my children in grade 1, 2 to know that when they come to this university, all of them can be respected. All of them.
All right. So, how honest do you want me to be?
100%.
I want you to be critical, and I want you to be ethical, and I want you to be able to answer some of these questions.
Well, I don't quite understand, first of all, your view of ethics. I don't quite understand what you mean.
I want you to take into consideration these 3 spheres. I told you.
What are the 3 spheres? Sorry.
Ethics of justice, ethics of critique, and ethics of care. If you want to Google, you can Google. The books are out there. You can get anything if you want to.
Okay, so there's 3 spheres. Okay, so there's 2 questions here. One is an Leroy Littlebear comment. I'm just going to. I know him very well, and I'm going to be very honest about Leroy Littlebear, which many people are not. Anyway, Leroy Littlebear has nothing to offer us in the world today in terms of his quote-unquote knowledge. It is absolute nonsense. Complete nonsense. If you want to see Leroy Littlebear, which I did, and I actually went I didn't go with another colleague of mine, but he was in the audience as well. It's on, it was at 2016 University of Calgary, part of their Big Ideas series. So it was seen as being a big idea. The lecture was like a lecture like this, but it was larger. There was more people. People gave him a standing ovation. And Stephen Toope, who should be completely ashamed of himself, said this was incredibly enlightening. this talk. And it just made no sense at all. It was all about spiritual beliefs of Leroy Littlebear, had nothing to offer physics whatsoever, which he was claiming. He even talked about going for drinks with Einstein and stuff. It was absurd. And that's the kind of condescension that we see for Indigenous people these days. I swear, take a look at that video, judge for yourself. But and the person I was with was a computer scientist, a PhD in mathematics. Said it was absolutely ridiculous. So it's not, I don't have any knowledge of physics, so what do I know? But it's obviously, Indigenous people didn't have numbers. How are they going to have mathematics and physics? It's ridiculous. Come on, stop condescending to Indigenous people. Anyway, that's my honest opinion. I know, but in terms of ethics, right, you're saying justice, critique, and care. So what I said there about Leroy Littlebear, which is completely honest, how is that related? How does that, if I were to do a, justice or critique or care, justice and care, care is...
That was not about nothing. I said, in your pursuit of liberty,
Yeah.
how you anchor that freedom of knowledge on ethics. Because I would be very skeptical of any university in the world that has total free-for-all pursuit of liberty without being anchored on ethics. Ethics is a part of any university. It's philosophy. So if you're not anchored, your knowledge and liberty of knowledge and ethics, then there's a disconnect. So I wonder, what is your view and your stance on ethics in your pursuit of knowledge and freedom of knowledge?
Well, ethics for me is, I don't want to treat anyone differently than how I want to be treated myself. It's kind of a golden rule kind of idea, I guess. I certainly don't think research should be undertaken that doesn't have people consenting to it, right? But that's a very difficult issue, obviously. I know that's a big ethical kind of thing that's happening. So, but it's a very, you can imagine that's a very, I don't understand even how to answer that question. It's very, very difficult for me to do it. I think I have an obligation, however, to tell people what I think is true. That's my obligation. And I know that if Leroy Littlebear were hearing this, it would be very hurtful for him to hear that, probably. Or maybe he wouldn't care. He'd just say, well, who cares? But, so I feel a little bit, concerned that I don't want to hurt his feelings, but it's just that the absolute nonsense that's going on all the time, you gotta say, come on, people. We have, physics is a very, very disciplined inquiry, which has occurred, from Newton to Einstein and all sorts of complex developments. You're talking about people who don't have numbers that are somewhere could be contributing to physics. That's an absurd situation that we're talking about here. In terms of truth is a universal, right? Truth is reality, what exists. To say that there's different truths, now you could say, I think the world is flat, you think the earth is round, the earth being flat is my truth. But that's not true, that's just my subjective opinion, right? And just if I can bear with me here, I think often for myself, I often separate things into three levels in terms of these dimensions. One is opinion or belief, which doesn't really have any evidence, it's just what I happen to think. Then there's knowledge, which is a belief that is based on the best evidence that is available. But it's possible that that could be not true, because you're going to have new evidence that comes up, so that means new knowledge is going to be developed. So knowledge is always contingent. And then there is truth, which is the actual reality that we're trying to reach, but we never do reach, because we don't have the instruments to be able to reach that truth. It's there, but we just can't access it. So I think those three levels are very helpful in terms of belief, opinion, doesn't really have any evidence, I just kind of think it, knowledge, best evidence that is available, truth, the actual reality that we're all trying to understand.
Okay, so in the middle here, the striped shirt, and then after that we'll go on the right side here, and then
Hi, I'm not Canadian, so I'm trying to put this under the scope of trying to contextualize things. I wanted to understand why the Canadian government enabled through taxes and legislation for Indigenous people to have things like casinos, gambling, alcohol, tobacco, those kind of black market or gray market, different regulatory approvals. Do you believe that the Canadian government not only has different rules for those people that could create black markets, and also do you think that's a good way to move forward, or should there be some different implementation of rules to help Indigenous people adapt to Canadian society? So I want to understand what the purpose of these rules and what the purpose accomplished, and how should we move forward?
Yeah, I think that is these kinds of, as you say, black market, different regulations.
Yeah.
That's part of the whole rent-seeking dynamic of Indigenous policy. Has huge problems in terms of integration, right? Because it's sort of setting up the barrier to entry. That's the nature of it, right? So instead of and it's not to say that I don't think there should be other things that are looked at in terms of programs to help Indigenous people increase educational levels and so on. I think that's kind of where the movement should be in focusing on that. But what these kinds of barriers to entry to non-Indigenous people, that's what you're doing. You're creating a barrier to entry so that Indigenous people can set up a casino, but non-Indigenous people can't. You're kind of hiding the problems by doing that. And then you create a whole bunch of other problems, right? Because those areas which are black market areas have a high degree of criminality to them, often involves various forms of smuggling, gun running, all these kinds of very, very negative kinds of characteristics, which I think are a problem. Oh, it's totally true. Gun running.
Can you show some
Yeah, we would love some proof. Let's got actual evidence.
Hey, it's well known that there's guns through the Kanesatake, by the way, the Kanesatake.
So that knowledge, where she trust that knowledge?
You and your
Everyone's,
when you're critiquing me indicates you have a universal conception of knowledge.
Excuse me? During the Oka crisis, after that was over, the RCMP recovered a number of prohibited automatic weapons, which have not been allowed in Canada since the 1980s. So, how would those have gone into the country?
I'm just trying to find some
Anyway,
scientific method.
I think you're jumping the queue. We should restore order.
I can't deny that some of the things you've said are probably taking place, such as people taking advantage of the what you claim is indigenization. But I also have to say that there are cases that you've given that offer almost cartoonish mischaracterization of indigenization, and also your critique of others who criticize you as racist is really damaged when you don't actually rely on facts. You just claimed a few moments ago that Indigenous people had no numbers. I work with Mayas at a time when 1,000 years, 2,000 years before Europeans were using the zero, Mayas were making calculations of essentially precession, which is a 26,000-year cycle. That's science. However, the question I have for you has to do with your opposition to the teaching of the mandatory teaching of Indigenous studies classes at universities. In Germany, still today, students in every school are required mandatorily to take courses in order so that the country knows its history. Do you think that this is something that Canada does not need?
Thanks very much. I appreciate you coming here. I very much appreciate it. And I hope you do understand. I'm just trying to be truthful in terms of what I'm saying. I'm not trying to be needlessly inflammatory, and I do feel a little bit nervous about the comments that I was making about Leroy Little Bear, because that is, I can't keep on going on with that situation. The numbers I was talking about is North America, Canada, numbers within Canada. There's no evidence of numbers existing in Canada in terms of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or even a tallying system, right? Like Roman numerals, or that doesn't exist. So that's a fact, as far as I know. Until someone shows me evidence of there being numbers in North America, which I have not seen, which I could change my mind if people did provide me with evidence of pre-contact numbering systems, right? I would change my mind, but I haven't seen that.
Mexico is part of North America. Mayas live in North America.
Well, what's now Canada? Canada is my area of study. So any of the groups, the Haudenosaunee and the Blackfoot and so on, right? And so within Canada, what's now Canada? Indigenous groups, no numbers. Certainly the Blackfoot, which is Leroy Little Bear, didn't have numbers, right? So you got to ask yourself, think critically here.
The Haudenosaunee call themselves the Six Nations. Clearly, they were able to come.
This is post-contact.
Yeah. The Genocide Convention of 1948 says that genocide includes not just the extermination, partial or wholly, of a group, the physical extermination, but also the taking away of children, which is what the boarding schools did. It was literal genocide. And so your comparison, the facts would say that your comparison is actually wrong.
But taking away children isn't the definition of genocide. That's not the right definition.
It's in the definition of genocide that we use internationally. Go look at the 1948 genocide.
That's the definition of kidnapping.
It's in the 1948 Genocide Convention.
Well, we shouldn't be deferring to these documents as if they are sacred texts.
It is international law. That's what I'm referring to.
Well, international law is based upon arguments about the way things are and various forms of analysis. If we were going by the laws that were created 200 years ago, then we would have terrible injustices. So, as an academic, I don't just look at the United Nations and say, the United Nations said X, therefore it must be true, right? And I do not think that it is helpful to use the word, I do not think it's helpful to put the word cultural in front of the word genocide. Genocide, the intent of that word was the intended extermination of a group of people. That's why the Holocaust, and the Nazi Holocaust, is called a genocide. And you can look at the Armenian genocide if that were the case, and this is what's going on, because we're getting at like an overt racist attempt to rid the genes of a particular group of people. The Indigenous situation was quite different than that, and we can say that was terrible, that happened, the whole nature of the residential schools, very, very coercive and problematic, and didn't respect Indigenous culture and all the kinds of problems that certainly were the case. But to compare the residential schools to the Nazi genocide is not helpful at all to reaching a better understanding. And there are many people who are saying that the residential schools were a Holocaust, like the same as the Nazi Holocaust. That is a complete misrepresentation of the residential schools, as far as I'm concerned, and I would hate to see that. No one is saying, oh, the Holocaust was just a great thing that happened, or it wasn't even that bad. Everyone sees that as a horror of actual genocide. With the residential schools, you know, there's a whole bunch of different views on what their nature was and how we can discuss it. I'm worried about those courses turning into indoctrination sessions by this sort of indigenization group, which in my view is not really examining the residential schools very objectively from a historical perspective. Now, it would certainly be good to have courses on that. That would be a good idea, but it should be done through a process of critical thinking. The other problem with sort of imposing courses is it's possible you could make people very resentful as to having to take those courses. And I have heard other academics mention this, is that if you want to sort of provide courses, that's great. People who want to take them, then take them. But if you're going to impose it upon people, then you're going to get pushback, saying, why do I have to take this course? And especially if it's going to be taught in this kind of very what I would consider to be propagandistic methods, right? I'm all for increasing the number of courses that are taught on Indigenous subjects, Indigenous, non-Indigenous.
My first question, and I hope it answers my second question, but if not, I'll ask if I can ask the second question. And that is, the first question is, so you say that indigenization is not the correct way. You talked about the achievement gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, and enrollment gaps and so on. What would be, as an example of Indigenous people underperforming, let's say, compared to non-Indigenous people in Canada on all sorts of metrics, economic, social, whatever, what would be your proposed solution then to this problem?
All right. So the first one about the numbers, we have to be very careful there as to whether we're talking about a post-contact or a pre-contact situation. I have not seen any evidence of numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, existing in a pre-contact situation, whether it's, etchings on stones or whatever it may be. And it's true with the Mayan, you actually do have evidence of the numbers. So I wasn't meaning to imply that the Mayan didn't have numbers, because we do have evidence. Saying the longhouses use some kind of architectural mechanism, that's not, people can put up dwellings without numbers. And we have to realize, and it's possible that I'm mistaken, we have to realize that human beings in their earliest cultural forms, and I'm not saying this is Indigenous, but their numbers came out of things. Like the other animals don't have numbers. So numbers developed at some point. So that's what we have to be thinking about a little bit when we think about this. And I have not seen that in terms of, now I could be mistaken, but certainly if they did have numbers, it would have been very rudimentary forms. It would not have been the kind of mathematical system. It's kind of this is what I'm getting at with respect to Leroy Littlebear. If we're going to say that he thought up the theory of relativity, or not him, but the black had that before Einstein, which is the sort of argument that's being made. Einstein based his theory of relativity on Newton and everything that came, and there's huge amounts of evidence of physics going back through thousands of years. That's what I'm getting at here, not. And it's possible there might have been some rudimentary system, but I have not seen evidence of that. So until I do, I will change on that situation. But it's really, I was doing that for Leroy Littlebear, but that's just an absurd argument, which I think I can't stand it anymore to hear this repeated all the time. In terms of Indigenous people and what to do about it, okay, well, this is a very interesting question, which is, and we aren't in agreement at this point, which is the, so the cultural characteristics that exist in these isolated communities, is the kinds of concepts and understandings less developed than what exists in modern nation states? That's the question. People who are indigenizing say, no, it's in fact another way of doing things. And if you want to be an engineer or a doctor or all these occupations, you can do that just as well with the Indigenous ways of knowing as you can with training in science and all the modern disciplines. So that's a big question. And where I would argue the former, which is a less developed kind of systems of knowledge and understanding, if that's the case, there has to be a bridging process that goes on that enables people to increase their understanding of why the world is the way it is. And that's if that is true, which I'm just putting forward as a hypothesis, you need quite an extensive remedial education system put in place in the communities which does not exist at this time. And I would argue that's the real problem that is facing these isolated communities. That's the problem. People are lumping all these things in together. We've got 75% of Indigenous communities which are in terrible shape. Just terrible, isolated places where people cannot get out of those places. They're stuck. And that needs to be addressed. And all these indigenization processes are obscuring this human tragedy which is unfolding before our eyes. I have heard estimates of fetal alcohol syndrome in these communities being at about 50%. Horrible, horrible situation. And that's going to do something about that is massive intervention, and governments are reluctant to do that. It's a big, big problem, if that's true. So I don't know. I'm just saying that we haven't come to an agreement about the cultural situation in the communities. And until we do, we're not going to be able to move forward, or we're just going to continue on the indigenization path, which I think personally is just avoiding the problem.
Right. If I can add my second question, which is, so you mentioned at the start of the talk that you're a socialist and an anti-capitalist.
Yes.
I would consider myself an anti-capitalist as well, but not of the socialist kind. And what it seems to me is that what you're proposing is essentially like the vision that you would like is a sort of not assimilation but integration, let's say, into Canadian society, which you described as they can practice their own customs within their own sphere, that they can voluntarily go to their organizations and participate in their ceremonies and whatnot, but that they would still be integrated into society, whatever that means. To me, and this might just be assumptions on my part about your beliefs, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like this is the sort of the capitalist program, of taking what used to be, communities based on common identity and family ties and traditional ways of life and belief, and essentially making them cogs in a machine, like deracinated, essentially, like severed up from their roots. And that results in these people, whatever's left is just the superficial things of, that they might smear something on their kid's foot sometimes, but the genuine way of life of these people kind of disappears. An example of this, which shows...
other people.
Yeah, sorry, can I just... I'll finish right after this. A big example of this having negative effects is the policy of the Danish government in Denmark, and it's similar to the Inuit policy in Canada, where essentially the Inuits used to live based on hunting and whatnot, and fishing. But they were prevented from doing that, and instead of being able to have a nomadic lifestyle, they were settled into like commie block apartment buildings. And you see now they have absurd rates of suicide, and many of them are out of work because they've been unable to like.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there.
Sure.
Okay, no one's preventing. Like, people should be able to hunt and do all these things. No one should prevent anyone from doing that. No one should prevent people from speaking their own languages and practicing their spiritual beliefs, except when, with respect to the children, I should mention this, an Indigenous child died of leukemia because there was resistance to modern medicine. This is a problem. If the child hadn't been Indigenous, the state would have intervened, but it didn't, and the child died.
Other religions do the same thing.
Well, that should be stopped.
Absolutely.
That should be stopped. And for the Indigenous thing, it adds another layer to the situation. So the idea here is that with respect to our participation, right, we are human beings who need to participate in the global society. That's where we're at. If you can't do it, it makes it very difficult for you to figure out how you fit in with everything, right? So that's the challenge. How do you allow people not to be completely disrupted and mowed over by the machine, but at the same time recognizing that listening to Leroy Littlebear is not going to enable you to become a physicist. That will not do it, believe you me, right? And that's the lie. That's the lie that's being perpetuated. In order to be a physicist, you have to go through many years of physics learning, which is, believe you me, I've done 1 year and it's not easy. And you have to do that, right? There's no way getting around it, right? So that's the situation. We need to provide opportunities, skills, educational processes, and literacy, and all these sorts of things, and not to mention the terrible conditions of water and all this sort of thing, but at the same time trying to bring us all together into the modern society, instead of isolating and separating and saying, well, that's just the way that these isolated groups do this, you know. And they're really happy, obviously, evidenced by all the really high suicide rates, which are just horrible in these communities, because people don't understand how they fit with the global society.
Are you aware of Dr. Nancy Lark's research? She's a fantastic biologist from BC.
I think you've already had a question, so I think other people who haven't spoken should do that.
Just letting you know, there's lots of people working with Indigenous.
I think it's probably nonsense.
So I've worked with the Ministry of Indigenous Affairs, or whatever it's called now, and I've worked with reserves. I've seen firsthand how bad the conditions are there. I've worked specifically in flood preparedness because there's a lot of issues with water, as you mentioned. But I think that there's a basic question of, there's a schism right now, and how do you feel about that? It's, do we leave them behind in their sort of state that they were in for hundreds of years, or do we encourage them to leave behind their communities, leave behind their cultures, and come assimilate here? Like, neither option is good. I think that anyone can agree with that. But what do you feel is more harmful? To leave people in their natural state where they're suffering, but they're with their culture, or, you know, they have to abandon their culture, come to the big cities, move away from these isolated communities, and come live with the communities.
It's a really hard issue, and I really hope that we're able to bridge the gap, you know, gradually without the kinds of dislocations. I do hear people arguing that, you know, we should just close down the communities. And I think that would be a real problem. I really do, because I think that it is what people know, and it is what gives them comfort. And if you're going to rip them away from that, that is a very isolating and psychologically traumatizing kind of circumstance. So really, but the difficulty is the mentality that thinks that these communities can go on forever. They can't. Although it's true, these communities were connected to the fur trade, hunting and gathering societies, and so on. Hunting and gathering is not a viable existence in modern times. It's not. It doesn't give the kinds of you know, productivity. You don't have the productivity that's possible, and you have children in these communities watching television, watching the hockey and all the things that happen in modern society, and that's really what they see. Is, I mean, they think, well, why can't I be a part of that? But in these isolated communities, it's very difficult to bring those kinds of services and things to them. So that's kind of the challenge, right? But what we have here is that challenge isn't even recognized, because everyone's saying, well, you're just going to build up these 600 communities and to become nation states. I've even heard people compare communities to a country like Germany. So each of you got like 600 Germanys that exist again. This is just completely false, the way of thinking about it. These are dependent, isolated places, have no, and the word nation, of course, is the problem here. Nation was associated with the development of states. Self-determination was connected to that. So when we talk about indigenous nations, we're not talking about nation in the sense of Germany or France or even Quebec. We're talking about small kinship-based groups, dependent, don't have an economic base, don't have any institutions, have no way of being autonomous like a nation. So we should kind of recognize that language is a fiction and say we've got isolated groups, very deprived, how can we add things to that which makes it easier, makes that transition easier. But we can't even move, like we're not even there yet because we're stuck in what I call this parallelist position, which is separate societies, build up those communities, and that's just kind of delaying the real kind of thought that has to go into it.
Sorry, but what would you propose that we would do specifically with these communities?
Well, the education is a big one. So we'd stop it with all the indigenous ways of knowing nonsense, right, which is what's happening. You've got very undereducated people with a lot of cultural problems of not having a background of literacy and so on, and all sorts of social problems. You know, how can we go in there with, you know, with the help of educated indigenous people too, to try to improve educational levels. Certainly the water, you know, that is a big, huge issue. As to, you know, we can fix the water. You know, why is that not happening? I suspect the Aboriginal industry is at work here and draining money away rather than putting it into the water systems. Right? That's a ridiculous situation, and I haven't really looked into it, but something's not right there as to why that is not being dealt with appropriately. But all the time when you're trying to fix these, not fix them, but improve circumstances, you have to be always thinking about trying to bring people in to the wider society, not keeping people isolated, which is what is the dominant narrative right now.
It seems to me that it's quite paternalistic of us to think it's beholden that we have a responsibility to go in and fix this. These are not useless people. These are human beings. I also lived with a family of natives when I was a lad for the summer, and I think let the natives take care of themselves. There are some very successful native people. The people who are less successful have every opportunity to reach out to their own people and say, how did you do it? How can I do it? Instead of this paternal white man thing, like, we're going to reach down and help these people. These people are not helpless people. They're every bit as capable as we are.
The point, what you make, and I certainly think that the bringing in of the indigenous people who have ideas about this is very important. What happens a lot, though, is what I call neo-tribal rentierism, which is neo-tribal elites use their control over funding and these sorts of things to distribute money to their connected kinship elements. This does happen. And, you know, and this is the nature of the whole way in which indigenous policy goes on often, which is just send in a bunch of money, let the elites deal with it, and that money goes to a small segment and does not often go to the very marginalized elements. And that's the concern. You know, certainly there are indigenous people who can be, that's needed. But at the same time, we also have to realize capacity problems that exist in many of these communities as well. This is post-contact.
Yeah.